Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup for June 23rd, 2021, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators in the last few days. First up, what are agent aggregators? Second, are students more optimistic about U.S. study? And third, how can we understand the many layers of India when it comes to student recruitment? So those are the 3 questions we're going to look at today. And before we do that, I want to give a special shout out, obviously, to those watching live here on Facebook. It's always a pleasure to get your interactions on the day of the chats to see where you are and what thoughts are guiding you in these interesting days we live in. Next, obviously, those who take the time out of their weekly schedules to watch on repeat, either on the Facebook channel or our YouTube channel for SMIE Consulting. And those that download our podcast each week, the podcast version of the Midweek Roundup for an audio-only experience, listening to our thoughts on international education. So appreciate you being a part of the journey each week. For those that are unfamiliar with the Midweek Roundup, what we do is each Monday, SMIE Consulting puts out an e-newsletter that is called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And I dropped the link of the most recent edition of that e-newsletter into the chat on the Facebook page. But you can also find and subscribe to it at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And you can find an archive of all past editions of the newsletter, as well as links to subscribe to the podcast or get past versions of this roundup. So thanks very much for being a part of it, the roundup today. Let's get right into the first question. What are agent aggregators? Now, we've covered this in the newsletter quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 months because, frankly, it seems to be the hot new sexy thing in international education these days. And oftentimes it's that shiny object that people get drawn to and want to explore more. And some institutions are jumping in with both feet to using agent aggregators. But before we do that, let's step back and take a look at what actually are agent aggregators. What prompted this particular question today is there was a panel last week at a Pi News webinar on the role of student recruitment innovators debating digital disruption. And digital disruption is basically anything that is using online tools to perform similar functions that other on the ground or in-person people have done in the past. Now, agent aggregators itself has been used in recent months to apply to these new platform companies. When I say platform companies, I'm talking about Applyboard, I'm talking about Adventus.io, I'm talking about others like that have seen value in taking, and when they've had substantial venture capital put behind them as ways to, whether massification of international student mobility is happening already, but it's adding to that and allowing basically Applyboard to become a super agent and have a variety of agents that contract with them. And so they basically are the middleman that do all the payments for the transactions that are about to occur with students that enroll at institutions. The agents sign up to direct their students to Applyboard. Those students that apply through this platform to universities that have profiles on their site, on the Applyboard site, for example, are then compensated by Applyboard and Applyboard gets their revenue from the institutions that sign up for memberships with Applyboard. Now, there are other versions of these out there that have slightly different business models, but this is the general scheme here, is that Applyboard contracts with all these agents and contracts with the universities and serves as the kind of super agent for those that are looking to recruit students using the platform. What that does is the students that come to the Apply Board site will see all those institutions first in their searches that are connected with Apply Board, that have services through Apply Board. So that is the kind of the hook that gets institutions in. And then if those students apply and enroll at that institution, then that's great for the university. Their payment for each of those students is already taken care of really through their membership through Apply Board. They're not paying extra for students that enroll through the platform. So what is different in terms of agent aggregators is that when you think about it, if you're looking at that model of super agent and then all these sub-agents, that the platforms provide, that has been done, frankly, for decades already in the business, with larger agencies in bigger countries like China, like India, that might have multiple sub-agents that work for them. That has been normal business practice in international education, in agency models for years. But you also have groups like IDP. IDP is kind of the granddaddy of them all when it comes to agent aggregators. And they provide the same kind of services across a range of countries where they have agents in place that are IDP agents that are working for IDP to recruit students for IDP member institutions that either, obviously, were founded in Australia to recruit for all the Australian universities. That's obviously still very much a part of what they do. But they have, in the last decade or so, have been recruiting for British, Canadian, and U.S. institutions. So this is something that IDP has a role that they played since the mid-'80s, for serving as a super agent and with a number of sub agencies in different countries that represent them and the institutions that they represent. So IDP right now has over 600 university partners worldwide that are having students directed to them through IDP. So that's another version of it. A more recent one, probably in the last 10, 15 years, that most people in the U.S. are aware of and have been around for 15 more years, is the pathway provider model, where companies like Into, like Shorelight, like Navitas Study Group, Cambridge Education Group recently, coming onto the scene, King's Education, that have their own network of agents around the world that recruit students for their member institutions, that have pathway provider programs for them, either on their campus or in third-party locations. So these aggregators have existed for a number of years, and really, frankly, what's happening now is, as we've seen accelerated with the pandemic, is everything has gone online, and online is seen as, well, if you're not online first or digital first, then you're behind, and then people are not traveling and they want the simpler and quicker approaches to find students that are willing to come. That's a model that really is attractive for those that are looking in it for the quick fix or the simpler solutions. There are challenges that this article that the PI News reporting on in a webinar that they hosted, was hosted by a number of panelists that are in this agent aggregator mix, these technological disruptors that we're talking about, people from study portals, from Apply Board and other things, other models out there that are very much in the ed tech disruptor space. So it seemed to be a little bit self-indulgent in terms of the tone of the article and the webinar itself, in terms of these ed tech disruptors saying, yeah, we are the be all and end all. But the reality is these companies there are parts of what they do that take away the role of face-to-face interaction, because the students that are being pushed to these sites through their individual agents are not necessarily getting the interaction with with the agents or with the universities that they might normally have had in a traditional agent university relationship. They are also, universities also lose a lot of control because they don't know always which agents are pushing students and how well they are representing their institution. And they're not really representing their institution because the contracts are with the Apply Board, not with their agencies. The control is really is what's missing. And some institutions, I know a couple here in Ohio that are exploring relationships with some of these ed tech disruptors and these agent aggregators. And that seems to be a legitimate concern on the institutional side, is losing that control over what messages about their institutions are being delivered to students that are coming through these agents, these amorphous group of agents that the institutions don't know from Adam necessarily, and those agents don't necessarily know them and their processes and their programs and all the things that you expect in a traditional agent relationship. So aggregators are certainly a regular part of the conversations these days in international ed circles, and certainly they're nothing new, but the newness of what these ed tech disruptors are bringing to the conversation certainly has generated a number of articles over the past 5 or 6 months related to whether they're good or bad, or too impersonal, too technologically driven, that are good conversations that need to be had when it comes to determining where your institution wants to sit with regards to enrolling international students from abroad using these new platforms. Technology is always an answer. It's not the only answer, but it certainly needs to be an important tool in your arsenal as you include and improve your international education, international admissions, recruitment processes. And that's what it really comes down to, is processes. And that's something I talk about is with my client universities, and we'll be having a couple conversations about this very topic today, is where will your strategies take you, and what are we investing in these as you build a plan, as you build the capacity on campus, as you build the resources you will need to bring in those students and to maintain those students while they're here, and to make sure that they're enjoying their time. And that's something that after when all the dust settles from all the excitement of these newness of these platforms, the reality is, until you see the quality of students coming through, and not just looking at all the applications that a particular platform has generated for institutions, it's the results really. What's the retention rate of those students that eventually do get placed through these aggregator platforms? What is the care for the individual student throughout their journey, not only in the admissions process, but once they're on campus, are they taken care of? It all adds up to what will make or break your enrollment success story on your campus. So aggregators are out there. They've been there for a number of years, but they are in new and varied forms. And it's incumbent upon institutions to really do their due diligence and understand the implications of going down certain paths when it comes to establishing relationships with any provider, really. But go in with your eyes wide open and make sure you know what you're getting into. And that helps at least set the tone for and I'd be sure to ask the tough questions. So it sets the tone for a relationship with any provider, whether it's a year or 2 years or long term, you want to know what you're getting. And if those expectations are not met, then there needs to be get out clauses. There needs to be ways that the situation can be adjusted to your benefit, because ultimately they're the service provider, and if they're not able to meet the expectations, then you have every reason to cut bait. So with aggregators, we'll talk more about this new phenomenon in the weeks and months to come, I'm sure. But for now, let's move on to our second topic of the day, one that I always like to talk about, and when I see these kind of bright light stories. Last couple weeks in the newsletter, we've been featuring highlights of a recent IIE snapshot survey for the spring. They did one in the fall enrollment snapshot survey for international education week, and we'll talk about the implications of this latest survey results in a minute. And the question is really, are students more optimistic about U.S. study? And we've seen from a number of different sources, from IDP, from QS, from a number of other in-country sources in India, in China, that have indicated that yes, interest is back up in the U.S. as a result of the election, as a result of the U.S. coming out of the pandemic and maybe being ahead of the curve for vaccinations and getting back to a more normal state, whatever that may be, or whatever that might look like. And there is that definite sense of optimism now. And we look at what this article, University World News article, is titled "Survey Finds Optimism on Return of International Students." And it's specifically centered around the United States here. What it does go into, some more details about this survey. The high-level things are 86% of U.S. institutions are focused on bringing students back to campus, 86% planning some type of in-person study this fall. None of the reporting institutions intended to offer virtual only this fall. So that's encouraging. And that's certainly what students want. That's one thing we've heard from every survey throughout the pandemic is students will make decisions based on where they can get face-to-face instruction, because ultimately that's what international education is all about. The digital patch that everybody has been riding the last year and a bit, when students, all colleges went online back in March, April last year, that switch was a temporary fix. To allow students who wanted to enroll, who were enrolled, to continue their programs, to start their programs, but also to find a middle ground that even for those that were on campus in terms of how classes are taught, whether larger lectures should all be in person, is probably something that's going the way of the dinosaur, and that online versions of those may still be continuing throughout. So there's going to have to be a reset at some point when it comes to in-person versus hybrid in the immigration regulations, since there are some courses that will go from fully in-person to a hybrid, like these large lecture classes that were supplemented by smaller in-person discussion sections perhaps this last year. So we're looking at a time where this fall, this survey, 90% of institutions plan to offer in-person study to international students. When looking at the application volume, 43% reported increase in their international student applications for this coming fall intake, and that's almost double the increases reported by institutions a year ago. International student applications vary depending on institution type. Doctoral universities noted application increases, about 60% of them did, while a majority of community colleges are still reporting declines, so in international applications. So that's a little bit of a worry longer term, as they've already been hard hit during the pandemic, and as our ESL programs connected to them. So that's interesting to see that. But we're talking about, with this IIE survey, the pandemic was a down year, obviously, for applications for 2020, and the fifth of institutions at that point expected a similar rate of applications to this year, but that's changed. Now, what is also interesting, some of the other nuggets that came out of this, where institutions are directing a lot of their resources. And when one of the questions is highlighted the impact on international student exchange for the spring, planning for fall and beyond. One of the things that was interesting, most U.S. higher ed institutions, according to the survey, 77% reported funding outreach and recruitment of international students at the same level or higher than pre-pandemic. Institutions, in terms of how they're focusing their events, online recruitment events, 73% had participated in those, working with current international students on other campuses, so recruiting domestically, and social media. So those have been the three drivers for a lot of institutional recruitment efforts over the past few months of the pandemic. What is interesting also, as we look to arrival of new international students this fall and returning of international students that were previously online, more than half of institutions, 64%, plan to provide vaccinations to students, faculty, and staff on campus, including international students. But less than half, 45%, do not plan to require a vaccine before a student arrives. Only 14% of institutions have a definite requirement in place right now. Not to say that more won't be added in the coming weeks and months, but right now, only 14% of those that were surveyed by IIE had indicated they have a definite requirement for a vaccine in place. And I think last week in our newsletter we referred to, actually this week's newsletter indicated the Chronicle list that gets regularly updated had about 550 institutions. So still not a majority, well under a majority. That are not requiring it, and for various reasons that we've discussed on the Roundup before. But what is important, I think, it's a time when institutions are not always thinking international first when they come up with these policies related to vaccinations. And I think there's some colleges that are certainly creating policies that are, we'll talk about this more next week, that are creating policies and requirements that are even being challenged now in court. So as to whether those are going to be allowed for the fall. So most of the indications from this survey are certainly positive, and we're certainly looking to see more of that developed in the weeks and months to come as we get closer to orientation dates in August, September. But good news coming out on the optimism front. I think from the institutional side, we're seeing it in terms of the numbers that are coming in. We're seeing it from various student surveys. So I think certainly this fall cannot be any worse than last fall. We've been seeing positive signs in China and India with U.S. consulates making additional visa appointments available or being open to now having regular student visa appointments. And that's in those two top markets. That's going to drive our success as a nation with enrolling students this fall. Many other countries still have some challenges here and there, but the good news is the greater majority are now open for business that are important sources of students for the United States. So optimism is certainly on the uptick on all levels, I think, in inbound international student education here in the U.S. So let's shift gears to our final question of the day. And it's one that is, anyone who knows me knows that India has a special place in my heart in terms of where my experience has been as an international student admissions person in my past lives in international ed, in recruitment, in working with tour providers, in working with planning committees, all the various elements, individual counselors on the ground. It's a very complex market, and that's something I think for the number 2 sending country to the United States, formerly the number 1 back in the early 2000s. But what I think is important about India is how do we understand the many layers of it, is that you want to get to what drives any audience or any market you're looking to go into. You want to find out what drives interest. And this is something that is absolutely 101 when it comes to planning, country level planning. And some of the institutions I'm working with now, this is where we're going to be building out country level plans, that you do not recruit the same way in India as you do in China. You do not recruit the same way in Brazil as you recruit in Nigeria. There are different strategies that work depending on the countries that you're recruiting in, how you recruit, where you recruit, which groups you work with, what platforms you choose, what partners you identify. Those all matter depending on the countries that you're looking at. So when it comes to India, one thing I've been encouraged with lately is how proactive the U.S. Embassy has become in getting PR out through in-country sources, news networks, about why they're opening or why they're not opening. This has been going on for, obviously the pandemic's been rolling on for a while, and up until early May, the consulates and embassies in India had been closed. But the important thing is the embassy had been, at that time, even before then, were constantly updating local news media, encouraging, particularly post-election, encouraging folks to stay calm and keep calm and carry on old British Empire. a tool that they use effectively for years, but unfortunately, fortunately, it does have some, those words do have some impact. And I think when it comes to India and the U.S. relationship with India, the U.S. has always been seen, I think, as a very welcoming country for Indian immigrants, Indian students, those that want to work in country. And that is a prime driver, frankly, of not just those that work in tech companies in India or U.S. Locations. They hope to come to the U.S. for jobs, but also for students that look to come for degrees, bachelor's and master's degrees, and then end up working through OPT and H-1B. All of those are very legitimate and very much sought after pathways that Indian audiences look for. And U.S. knows that any changes or proposals to change work-related topics impact levels of interest. There were periods where the U.S. might have been down a bit, and Australia and the U.K. were popping up. Australia is down right now because they've remained closed during, even at the tail end of the pandemic in Australia. They've not reopened to other countries. And there were major complaints coming out of students in India that had enrolled in Australian universities that were having to do their classes entirely on their mobile phones, and then paying as if they were in country for that privilege. And there are certain negatives that have occurred over the years with relationships between the U.S., between the U.K. and India, Australia and India, the U.S. and India, that will ebb and flow where the majority of Indian students go. The U.S. is still the #1 destination for Indian students, but Canada's been chipping away at our lead there. The U.K. seen a resurgence. Australia had until recently seen a resurgence. So we're in a position now in the U.S. where I think we're seen much more favorably than other than Canada and maybe the U.K. So I think with regard to India, it's important for our embassy and on-the-ground officials there through Education USA, and which enjoys a very good relationship with the embassies and consulates in terms of co-promotion of events and networks or other networks for distributing important content about student visas and H-1B visas. So this is the embassy has come out recently in the last week with stories that the embassy in India plans to hold more visa interviews than before the pandemic. That's the kind of signal to the Indian market that, hey, we are open for business. We are going to do everything we can to make it easier for you to apply for your student visas and then get to the United States. So that's encouraging. That's really encouraging. What is also another layer is understanding that need for information and to be upfront and honest with your markets about, as a government and as the kind of the gatekeepers for visas purposes. You also see how invested in the Indian market is in U.S. employers and international firms, multinationals that have operations in the U.S. that maybe they want to go work for one day. You see in another news story out of the Times of India, this is something that is regularly getting press there. When I mentioned earlier any changes or lawsuits that threaten OPT or H-1B always get regular mentions in Indian newspapers and media sources. This article is about the lawsuit that had been filed 3 or 4 years ago, actually, to challenge the legitimacy of OPT as a detriment to U.S. workers. Obviously the Trump administration and Biden administration both have filed in their defense of OPT, have filed reports and briefs that U.S. jobs are not threatened by OPT and H-1B. In fact, they point to the number of companies that startups that have been created as a result of international students or students that have come for H-1B. They point to the number of degrees that are offered in those fields that are not being awarded to U.S. students because U.S. students aren't enrolling in those STEM-related programs at the same numbers. We've talked about that ad infinitum here. But this Times of India story, it talks about the U.S. companies, prominent U.S. companies, file amicus brief to support OPT for international students. Again, that's great PR for the U.S. in India because those connections to work, post-study work, are absolutely essential and main drivers of interest in India that are looking to where they go abroad. The UK's seen an uptick because of their reintroduction of post-study work. Canada's seen huge jumps in India because of their hugely welcoming and open immigration policies that provide very clear pathways to work and residency after they're done with their studies. Australia has similar pathways as well, but because of entry requirements right now, they're not on the hot list for Indian students, or as hot a list. So that's another great news story that makes sense for the United States. And the final one is really, it's an article about the cancellation of Class 12 board exams for students in India. And anyone who's recruited there, had conversations regularly with Indian students before they arrive on campus, you know that it's in their DNA, in their culture they are a test-driven culture, much like Chinese are in that respect. But in India, these state boards, these CBSEs, are it for students that are looking to go on to university, whether in country or outside India. And because of that interest, it's if now not having that important, what they've been building their entire academic careers towards as a pre-university preparation, not having that exam is leaving them struggling for in some cases meaning and access to higher education options. So there a lot of folks in the U.S. Or a lot of Indians looking at the United States are wondering, oh my goodness, what happens if I won't have my Class 12 board exam results before I enroll? What am I going to do? Is the institution still going to allow me to start my studies? And it's incumbent upon U.S. colleges that you have policies in place to address these kind of issues. You may have already done this last year when, say, A-levels were canceled or IB exams were canceled in various places. Now you're doing it again this year with Gaokao and CBSEs. So you have to be proactive about this and keep your fingers on the pulse. That's why I obviously recommend subscribing to the newsletter that will give you the kind of call-outs when these kind of things are happening. But you want to be thinking about this and be proactive. So when you hear the possibility this is happening, you can get a policy in place, get communication out to your students. Even if you don't have a policy yet defined, let them know we're working on it, okay? Because communicating something rather than not at all and just let it be crickets on a very important issue for them is something that can really hurt you long term if you're silent on these important issues. Same thing on vaccination policies and entry requirements and study state for the fall. That all matters. So the more proactive you are, the more you understand the many layers of the student experience, particularly as it relates to India, the better prepared you are to enroll those students. And we wish you the best of luck with that process. It's not an easy one. It's a very trying time of year, obviously, in the summer. But we wish you at the beginning of summer here that your fall season is everything that you want it to be from orientation to a somewhat different recruitment season than last, but wish you all the best with that to come. So until next time, have a wonderful week. Cheers.